we're going to go to speaker view. Is that right? There we go. Great.
Review. So
Okay. So if you could all turn your microphones off, so so all of a sudden you don't have so you're not on stage suddenly in the middle of a story. If everybody could mute themselves, great. Thank you. So the inspiration for tonight came from the title of a poem which was written by a great Sufi, a Persian poet by the name of Hafez. And one thing I love about the poetry of Hafez is that he was from the 14th century, and yet his poetry to me seems more relevant than ever. He feels like he lives just up the street. He just feels like a contemporary. And I wish he did live up the street. I think if he lived up the street, I would learn Farsi just so I could go talk with him. Um, his poetry has a great sense of humor as well as it being profound and such. And even though he's writing from the Middle East and from the 14th century, I think his poems are still as relevant now as they ever were. And so, Hafez. The subject tonight is love, and for tomorrow night as well. In fact, I can't think of a better topic for us all to discuss until we die. For a life without love is of no account. Love is the water of life. So drink it down with heart and soul, and then show others the truth that you have found. Don't hide this secret. Take us to the source from which you have been drinking. Show us the fountainhead that you know of, and fill our jugs again and again and again, so that this will be the springtime of lovers, so that the dust bowl may become a garden, so that the sea will become filled with pearls, so that hearts become filled with compassion, so that the bird of the soul may rise in flight, so that our bodies may become holy soul, so that the common stone will become a ruby in time. Don't hide this from us. Take us to the source that you're drinking from, so that your elixir, your drink, your libation may be the water from which all lovers drink henceforth. The subject tonight is love, and for tomorrow night, and the next night, and the next, and the next. So the subject tonight is love. Cheers, salud, and great thanks to the great one, Hafez. One thing I love about that poem is that to me, one of the faces of love, as Hafez elucidates beautifully, is sharing, showing others what you love, taking them to the source, showing them where your passion lies, what you're interested in. And one thing I like about the poetry of Hafez and of Rumi also is they're constantly dismantling this idea of scarcity and replacing it with abundance. They're always talking about how there's more love when it's shared. There's more love when it circles around and is given to others. It's like gold. It's always better when it's in circulation. So, well, another aspect of love or face of love, I think, is compassion and forgiveness, and that includes self-compassion and self-forgiveness too. And I think there's a poem by the Spanish poet Antonio Machado that speaks to that beautifully. It's called "Last Night as I Was Sleeping." Last night as I was sleeping, I dreamt marvelous error that a spring had broken out in my heart. Anoche cuando dormía yo soñé bendita ilusión. I dreamt a spring was breaking out in my heart, and I said, along which secret aqueduct are you coming to me? Agua de una nueva vida, water of a new life, en donde nunca bebí, water of which I have never drunk before. Anoche cuando dormía yo soñé bendita ilusión. Last night, as I was sleeping, I dreamt marvelous error that I had a beehive inside of my heart, una colmena, and the golden bees, las abejas doradas, even fabricando, they were making white combs and sweet honey, de las amarguras viejas, from all my old failures. Anoche cuando dormía, soñé bendita ilusión. Last night, as I was sleeping, I dreamt marvelous error, that I had a fiery sun inside of my heart. It was a sun because it gave warmth like a hearth fire, and it gave light like a sun and made me cry. Anoche cuando dormía yo soñé. Last night as I was sleeping I dreamt bendita ilusión, marvelous error, que yo tenía Dios dentro de mi corazón. That it was God that I had here inside of my heart. The poem Last Night as I Was Sleeping by the great one Antonio Machado. I think part of the power of poetry, great poetry like that and great poets like that, is that even though it's old, it resonates through the ages and it comes to life again and again and again. It speaks a language like love, which of course is eternal, which is one of the things that we know about love. But to touch it in this temporal world is to touch something that's eternal. Well, there's many forms of love, and I wanted to tell a brief story about one of those. I'm a real lover of places. I'm a tourist. I'm sort of a place-based fixed earth kind of person. And one of the reasons I love Oregon is that there are so many marvelous places to visit. I know that's true everywhere in the world, but here I love coast and mountains and the plains and the canyons and the estuaries and the marshes and all of that. And all of those have a different presence, I think, a different voice to them. I read recently that in 1855 there was a Cayuse chief who refused to sign a treaty to turn land over to the federal government because not everybody had spoken. And the administrator said, "Who hasn't spoken?" And he said, "The earth hasn't spoken yet. The land hasn't spoken." And of course, they thought he was nuts. But then I thought, really, who's nuts? Someone that thinks there's no voice, no spirit, no song in the land. So this is a story that I want to dedicate to two friends of mine, John Rausch and Ken Margolis, who have been constant allies for the earth. They've been educators, conservationists, and activists, and they've listened to the voices of indigenous peoples as well as the voice of the land, and they've helped many other people to do the same. So in their honor, a story that I wrote years ago called The Story of River. Long ago, there was one who was moody, he was deep, he was restless, he was lonely, he was called Ocean. And one day Ocean looked in the distance and he saw her, this majestic, powerful, statuesque woman. Her name was Mountain. He wanted to know her, but he needed help, and he called to his brother Sun, and he called to his brother Wind, and they helped him. Sun warmed the waters of Ocean, and so fogs rose and clouds rose and mists rose, and then wind carried that towards Mountain. She was afraid to see these dark clouds coming, these swirling mists. But Ocean spoke to Mountain softly, the way gentle rain speaks, and wildflowers grew upon her, and streams trickled down from her. He came to visit her often. In winter, he brought her blankets of snow. She was never happier. She never looked more beautiful. In time, Ocean and Mountain, they had a daughter. They called her River. When she was a young woman, she said, "I will bring the worlds of my mother Mountain, my father Ocean together." And she began to travel. She was an artist. She was a sculptor, a dancer, a singer. And on her long journey, she sculpted canyons and wide valleys. On her journey, she leapt at places as she danced and made waterfalls. She sang, and the white water rose, and the song of the rapids rose. She was generous, River. She took silt, rich soil, and spread it out across the land, and in those places the willow and the wapato grew, the duckweed and the cattail reed. And because of that, in those places, great blue heron came, and so did eagle and osprey, merganser and duck and goose, kingfisher, red-winged blackbird, and many, many more. River otter was there, and beaver and muskrat. Her waters soon teemed, swelled with fish, sturgeon and salmon and eel and trout and others. At long last, river, she finished her journey from mountain to ocean. And now there was a pathway so the gifts of mountain could flow to ocean and ocean to mountain. It was the salmon nations who came first, the Sakai and the Koho and the Chinook peoples. They swam up into the heights of mountain and back down to ocean. And on their journeys, they would carry the deep mysteries of ocean to mountain and the song of the mountains to ocean. People came in time. Two-legged people came. They would ask River, they would say, River, these reeds that grow on your shore, these willows that grow, they are good for shelter. May we use them? She would say, yes, take them, take what you need. They would say, River, the fish in your streams, they feed us, they're good for bone and flesh. May we eat them? She said, you may, but live beside me in a good way. Take your place in this web of life. And they did. They listened to the song of River. They knew her voice. There was nothing they loved more. They knew they only lived there because of the gifts that River had given. And because of that, they gave her gifts in return, gifts of song and ceremony and poetry and story. Thousands and thousands of years passed in that way. But more people came. And those people didn't hear the voice of River, didn't listen to the song of River. Their voices were loud. They didn't ask for what they needed. They took whatever they wanted. They would say, River, you are strong. Grind that grain. River, you are powerful. Turn the wheel. Cut our lumber. River, you are strong. Carry these ships. Carry those boats, River. Do that. River, water our fields. River, power our cities. River, power our factories. And she did. She was generous. She always gave. But in time, rivers, currents, rivers' flows, they were stayed and they were choked, and her spirit grew weak. She was filled with refuse now. And at last she called out to her oldest friend, Grandmother Great Blue Heron. She said, Grandmother, the people who live beside me now, they have forgotten the ways of living. Something must be done. The next day, Great Blue Heron, she was very old. She stood on the bank of the river, and at first light she lifted her wings, and the winds carried her up like a great kite into the sky. And though she was lost many times in the dark storms and the strong wind, she at last arrived at the lodge of Rainmaker, who lives at the edge of the world. And he said, Grandmother, you've come a long way. What is the nature of your journey? And she said, Rainmaker, the people who live beside river have hearts that are hard and small, heads that are large and stubborn. They take without asking, they give nothing in return. Something must be done. The next day, Rainmaker, he gathered his thunder drum and he flew off. He counseled with the cloud people, the thunder people, the lightning people. And in time they gathered over the land where river flowed. The thunder drums pounded for days and the lightning flashed, and at last the skies, they opened up. But it was a gentle rain. It was a rain that Rainmaker called a rain of remembering, and it drew the people out of their houses and schools and factories and looked up into the sky, and as they did, that gentle, sweet rain washed the dust of forgetting from their eyes and the hardness from their hearts, the illusion from their mind. And after many days they saw clearly. And when they did, they looked out as if for the first time and saw River, all the gifts that she had given them, and how weak her spirit was. And then another rain began. It was the rain of waters that fell from their tears, as the people grieved and wept for a long time. But they say in time, those people, they return to their farms and fields, their factories, their schools. But they saw differently. They felt differently. And because of that, they began to live differently. I don't know. It's just a story. But as Barry Lopez, a great writer, once said, sometimes a story can help us to reimagine our own lives. And that's the story of River, dedicated to my friends John Rausch and Ken Margolis. To all of them, and to the voices of the earth and the voices, the song of River. Well, of course, since we are doing Valentine's Day, sort of Valentine's Day-ish, it is also a time to celebrate romance and sweethearts and heartache and heartbreak, and all of the above, because also love has to do with mates and soulmates and that kind of thing. A therapist once told me, he said, when you fall in love, and you have all that wonderful romance and those long ecstatic nights, he says, that's just anesthesia being applied to your heart for the soul surgery that's going to be happening soon. And then he said, when you fall in love, your ego says, this is great. And your soul says, at last, we can get some work done around this place. Well, I like that because I found, anyway, that relationship is transformative. Relationship is a spiritual path. Relationship does provide challenges. Like the bumper sticker said, relationship, the final frontier. And so a story about that kind of relationship. It was in one of those times, it wasn't thrice upon a time, it wasn't twice upon a time, it was what it was, yes, once upon a time. It was in that time before time was worn on our wrists or captured in clocks and put on walls. It was before time was divided into hours and minutes and seconds and nanoseconds. It was when time was just counted by the passing of seasons, by the phases of moons, by the slow ebbing and flooding of tides. It was in a time before so many people were doing hard time. It was in a time when people just seemed to have time. And in that time, there was a vast realm, a deeply forested realm, and it was ringed by great snow-capped peaks, and it was crossed by crystal clear streams. And you could see it on this particular night. There was a castle in that realm, and it was in the midst of winter. In the castle there was a room, and in the room there was a bed, and in the bed there was a princess, the youngest princess of the king and the queen, and she was sleeping so deeply, and in her sleep she had a dream. And in the dream she was walking through the woods, which is what she loved to do. And in the dream she came to the edge of the woods, and she saw in the middle of a meadow a beautiful golden wreath. It was like a crown, and light was emanating from it. It seemed to be on fire with heat. And it drew her to it, and she bent down to it, and she reached out, and just as she was about to pick it up in her dream, she heard this voice, this growl, and she awoke. And she was afraid. But on the other hand, she was mesmerized, because terror and beauty often go together. She couldn't get her mind off of that wreath. And after a while, her father, who loved his youngest daughter, he said, "What is it with you? What's happened? You don't seem to be yourself." And she said, "Well, I had this dream. It was nothing really, just a dream." And he said, "No, a dream is something. It can tell you about your past. It can portend the future. What was it?" And so she told him about this wreath. And then after a while, she forgot about it. Well, she forgot about it until that day. You know how there's always that day. On that day, she was in fact walking through the woods, which is something she loved to do. You need to know that her two older sisters, they loved the life of the castle, and they loved the life of embroidering things and sitting and conversing by the fire. But the youngest princess, she was more at home outdoors than in. She loved the winds and the weathers and the woods, and she was walking through the woods, and she came to the edge of the woods, and she stopped, because she saw in the meadow, it was springtime now, she saw the very wreath that she had seen in her dream. She knew it was exactly that wreath. And she was about to go towards it, but Well, there was something else. You see, in the middle of the meadow, there was an enormous white bear, this huge bear, and it was on its back, and it was playing with this wreath in its paws, twirling it this way and that way, and catching the light of the sun in it. And so rays of light, they shot this way and that way, and eventually a ray came right to her and illuminated her. And she gasped and she moved. And the bear noticed that. But for some reason, she was unafraid. She just walked along that ray of light towards that bear. And she said, "That wreath, I've seen that very wreath in my dreams. I know it." And he said, "Well, perhaps it's meant for you." And she said, "Oh, great bear, a wreath of that must be of great value, but my father is the king, and he would pay a goodly sum for it." But the bear said, "No, no, no. This wreath already belongs to someone. It can't be bought or sold." And she said, "Oh, who does it belong to?" And he said, "It belongs to that woman who will climb upon my back and ride away with me to my castle in my realm, for I too am a king. I am Valaman, the white bear king." Now, I know that some of you women are out there thinking, men will say just about anything to get a woman to, well, and some of you might be thinking, well, that's not that bad. I mean, I've done weirder things than jump upon the back of a talking bear to get a golden wreath. And some of you might be thinking, well, she's just a young girl. She's the third child, the youngest child, and they're easily fooled by, talking bears and shiny things. But she wasn't thinking that at all. She was just feeling the warmth of this bear's sad, beautiful eyes upon her. She was listening to his powerful but sweet voice, tender voice. She was seeing flecks of gold in his fur. And she was remembering that old Rumi poem, the one. "The moment I heard my first love story, I came looking for you." Not knowing how foolish that was. Lovers don't suddenly meet somewhere. They're inside of each other all along. That's the feeling she had. And so she simply said, "I will go with you. I will go with you. Come for me. Come for me. I live at the castle, not far away. Come for me." And he said, "I will. I'll come for you next Thursday. Thorsday, Bear's Day." And he said, "Farewell." And she said, "Farewell." And she went home. And her sisters, the older princesses, they were so glad, as was her mother and her father, to see the lightness in her step, the happiness in her had returned. That spell of melancholy that had laid over her, that was gone. And they were happy to know that she'd found the wreath of her dreams. But they were not so happy to know that she was going to ride off with a bear to some realm she'd never been to before. And so her father, he pulled her aside and he said, "Dear, I'm a king and you're a princess. We live in a castle. I have gold. I have a goldsmith. There's no reason to run off with some bear just to get a golden wreath. Tell me what the wreath looked like." And she did. And the next night, the goldsmith went to work, and in 2 days' time, the father came forth, that king, with this beautiful wreath. And she said, "Father, what a work of beauty and craft. It's mesmerizing." And he said, "Indeed it is. It is the wreath of your dreams, no?" "Ah, well, no, it's not exactly that wreath, Father. I don't know what it is. The wreath of my dreams, it was, I don't know, shinier or brighter or larger or smaller. I forget, but no, it's not exactly that wreath." Well, the king went back to the goldsmith again and again and again. "Do you think any of the wreaths were exactly like the wreath of her dreams?" No. And by now a week had passed. And couldn't you see Valaman there, the great white bear king, coming through the woods to gather up that woman to be his bride? And he came to the edge of the woods, and he was at the edge of the meadow, crossing the field towards the castle, when he saw men up there on the parapets of the castle. Because you see, the king had decided to welcome Valaman in a way that some fathers like to welcome suitors for their daughters, with arrows and stones and spears. But Valaman, he simply reared up and he swatted all those things away. And then he pounded his way through the door, and into the castle he came, and up to the king's chamber. And he said, I have come now to carry away that daughter of yours who desired to go with me. And the king said, well, Valaman, we have a little custom here. It's always the oldest daughter that marries first. And the oldest daughter said, what? But she wanted to please her father. And so in no time at all, though she was terrified of wild animals and the forest, she found herself on Valaman's back, hanging onto his fur, clutching for dear life, and shrieking as they rode through the woods. And she was wondering how strange life can be in a fairy tale, you know. A princess one day and riding on the back of a bear in the next. And he called out to her, he said, have you ever sat so softly as you do now? Have you ever seen so clearly? And she said, oh, I have. I sat more softly in my father's lap. I saw more clearly from his tower in the castle, and I wish I was there now. And Valaman, he thought, this relationship has some irreconcilable issues. And he turned around. And he dropped her off near the castle, just beyond a bow shot of the castle. But he came the next Thursday, the next Thursday, the next Bear's Day. And you know, being familiar with the fairy tale genre, you probably know. Well, yes, he had to have the second daughter. And she climbed upon his back. And she wanted to please her father as well, though she preferred to have a mate of the same species, but there she was, holding on, clutching his fur, and screaming at him, bear, bear, please, don't take such sharp turns. Bear, could you slow down? Bear, please. Next time we come to a creek, could you find a bridge instead of just going through the waters? My feet are freezing. And Bear, he thought, you know, this relationship, it's already come to its expiration date. And he turned around and dropped her off. Well, next Thursday, next Bear's Day, he came. He had to fend off an entire army to finally gain entrance to the castle and up to the king's chamber. But it was then the youngest daughter. She thanked him for enduring all of that. And he took that wreath that was around his neck and he put it upon her head. It fit perfectly. It was like a crown that shone upon her. She climbed upon his back. Now you need to remember, she loved the woods. She loved climbing trees and swimming in the streams and the lakes because that her legs were strong and she could grasp the sides of Valaman. Her hands were strong and she could hold on to his fur. And as they flew through those woods, she shrieked with joy. And the cold invigorated her. And time again, she felt like a rider upon a horse, for they found a common rhythm. And it was almost like the two of them were one being thundering through those woods. She was so happy. And he said, how are you up there? And she said, let me tell you this, Valaman, I have never seen more clearly, or sat more softly, or been so happy as I am now. They went through the woods all night long. He was able to see through by starlight or moonlight. And as daylight came, she wondered a little bit, as maybe you do too, what the living accommodations might be, you know. For she knew he was a bear, but he was a king, so she thought perhaps it's a luxurious cave of some kind, you know, with some tasteful cave drawings or something. So wasn't she a bit surprised when these mists began to clear and she saw in front of her the spires of an enormous castle, thrice the size of her own father's, and 10 times as grand. And wasn't she surprised as well to hear trumpets blaring as courtyard doors opened and attendants came out to them? She was taken in. She was given warm clothes. Later, she was bathed. Later, she sat at table with Valaman, the white bear king. And then the next night, he ushered her to his room. And not just with a little trepidation, she climbed into the bed. And he said, I must have it dark, very dark, to sleep. And she watched as this huge bear doused all the torches and the candles in the room. And she felt him get into that bed. And after a while, she could feel his arm moving out in her direction. And she waited for that sharp claw. but there was none. It was the fingers of a man. He drew her to him. It was the flesh of a man, the shoulders of a man, the face of a man. And that was good. For he still had the strength of a bear, but he was a man. And that was very good. They spent a beautiful night together. And she slept deeply. And then she awoke at first light, and there beside her there was a bear. And some women know this experience, a man by night and kind of a bear by day, going off to do bear-like things. But so it was. He was bear by day and man by night. And she thought, every relationship has a few strange things, but the fact of the matter was she loved him. And she knew he loved her. She trusted him. And life was good. She loved that place. But it was strange, for in several years' time she had 3 children, and each time Valaman the White Bear King, he spirited those children away from her. And he said, you must trust me. You must trust me without understanding. All will be well in time, but you must trust me. And there are good reasons for spiriting children away and bad reasons for doing that. And he said, trust me, this is the right thing. And for some reason she did. But at last it was time, she said, Valaman, husband, I love you, but I have to go visit my father, the king, my mother, the queen, my sisters, the princesses. It's been so long since I've seen them. And he said, before you go, let me tell you one thing. I would take the advice your father gives you, but I would hesitate to take the advice your mother gives you. And away she went. And her parents, her sisters could see she looked well. She was content. She was happy. She was well clothed. She had jewels. And she assured them all she was loved. And she, in turn, loved her husband. But her mother took her aside one day and said, tell me, what is it like to live with a bear? And finally she whispered, well, at night, you see, he's a man. Her mother said, really? What does he look like? Well, mother, I haven't really seen him yet. Oh, no. No, her mother said, that's not right. And she told her what to do. And the princess spoke to her father before she left. And her father, he asked her, do you trust your husband? Oh, I do. Do you love your husband? Oh, I do. Does he love you? He does. And then she told her what her mother wanted her to do, and the father said, no, don't. Be patient. But the princess got home, and she missed her husband, Valaman, the White Bear King, and they loved one another that night, and then he was asleep, and she was asleep, and then she decided to do what her mother told her to do. She lit a candle. And in the faint light, she held up the candle, and she looked, and she saw an amazingly beautiful man. His flesh, it just seemed radiant. She couldn't take her eyes off him. But of course, as she did that, the candle burned down, and you can imagine what happened. Some of the wax, it fell onto his flesh, and it burned him. And as it did, he woke, and he cried out, no, 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 no. He said, if only we could have waited one more month, one more phase of the moon, I could have met a man all of the time, but now I must leave. Now I can't stay with you. For long ago I was put under a spell through no fault of my own. And now I must go to the glass mountain to try to break that spell. And she said, a spell? She said, why didn't you tell me? And he said, to tell you would have been to fix the spell forever. I had to know perfect love for 7 years' time for the spell to be broken. It was a great deal to ask. We were almost there, but now I must go. And she said, I'm going with you. He said, no. But she wouldn't listen to him. In the morning, when he became bear again, she leapt upon his back. And now Valaman, he thundered out through the woods. It wasn't like the first time. She held to him, but now he was running through briar and bramble and through the woods. He forded streams and rivers, and her clothes were soon ripped and torn. Her flesh as well began to bleed, yet she held on, and she held on through all of that time, until at last she could hold on no longer. Towards dusk she was exhausted, and finally she fell off onto the cold, hard ground, and the last thing she saw was the white speck of Valaman, the White Bear King, disappearing over a low hill, and he was gone. She only had the strength to pull herself under the bough of a tree and gather leaves and moss around her as a blanket, and she shivered that night as she slept. She awoke weeping. She awoke in sorrow. She awoke not knowing what to do. She reasoned it would be best to go back to the castle, but she was in love. She wanted to be with Valaman. She wasn't entirely reasonable. And so she turned and she began to walk in the direction that he had gone. And it was long, and it was cold in the trackless woods. And to that part of love that all of us know, which is like riding a bear at times and falling off. And whether that bear is a relationship or whether that bear is some journey, some vocation that you've ridden, something that took you far away, sometime you knew that cold ground and had to walk on, some time of heartbreak, to those times. She walked on. Even though the wood was pathless, she walked on. She foraged for food, she drank in the cold streams. But you know how it is, even in the wilderness there are people that dwell there. And didn't she find a stone hut with a thatched roof one day? She knocked on the door. This old woman, this ancient woman, answered. And she said, "'Tis rare that we find anyone in these woods, and those that come by are usually lost or in trouble or looking for trouble. How is it with you?" "Ah," the princess said, "indeed I'm looking for trouble. I'm looking for my beloved Valaman, the White Bear King." "Oh," the woman said, "he was here, but gone so soon. To the glass mountain, east of the sun, west of the moon. But you, come in. It is late. Warm yourself by the fire. Bide with us for a time." And she brought her in. And in time a young girl came and gave her a cup of tea, and they supped together. And the princess and the young girl, they spoke. And after a while she said, "You know, you have lovely hair. Do you like to put it into braids?" And the girl said, "What are braids?" And so the princess, she did for that little girl what her sisters had done for her. She braided her hair and tied it up with ribbons, and she was so happy. And the next day at the table at breakfast, the girl said, "I have something to show you." And she went to the cupboard and she took out a pair of shears, a big pair of sewing shears, and she snipped at the air. And out of the air there came a beautiful green cloak that she gave to the princess. For remember, her clothes were ripped and ragged. She snipped at the air and made her a fine flannel dress and blouse and warm leggings and a scarf and a hat and gloves. And because it was a fairy tale, everything fit perfectly and was color coordinated, of course, too. And then the little girl, she said, "You know, these scissors, they have been of great use to us, but I think they would be a better boon to yourself, looking for Valaman, the White King Bear." And so she gave those to the princess. And as she left, the old crone and the young girl said, "Come again and bide with us." And the girl said, "You could tie my hair up again in braids, would you?" And the princess said, "I will do it with flowers and ribbons next time." And away she went. It was the same journey now. It was cold, wet, damp. She traipsed in the dark. But it was different now, too. For hadn't she known the balm of kindness? Hadn't she known goodness and love? And as a poet once said, before you know kindness as the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing. You must wake with sorrow. You must speak to it until your voice catches the thread of all sorrow, until you know the size of the cloth. Only then is it kindness that makes sense anymore. Only then is it kindness, do you understand, that is is what ties your shoes and sends you off into the day to mail letters and purchase bread. It's only kindness that raises its head from the crowd of the world and says, it's I that you've been looking for. And then it goes with you everywhere, like a shadow or a friend. The poem Kindness by the poet Naomi Sha'ib Nye. And so she walked with that kindness and with that warmth in her until she came to another hut. It was a hut of timber and planks, and she knocked upon that door, and again it was an old crone that answered. And she said, the princess asked, have you seen Valaman, the white bear king, my beloved? I seek him. Ah, the woman said, well, he was here but gone so soon, flying off to the great glass mountain, east of the sun, west of the moon. But you, come in. The dark will be coming soon, and the cold with it. Warm yourself. And again it was a young girl and this older woman. And the princess and the girl, they spoke, and the princess said, you have a lovely voice. Do you like to sing? And the girl said, what is that? So the princess did for her what her sisters had done for her. They taught her songs. You know, like mares eat oats and does eat oats and little lambs eat ivy. A kid'll eat ivy too, wouldn't you? And she sang for the first time, and she was so happy. The princess told her stories, and in the morning the girl said, I have something to show you. She said, what do you most like to drink early in the morning? And the princess said, well, mint tea with a dollop of honey. And the girl took from the cupboard a cup, and she poured mint tea with honey right into the princess's cup. And she said, whatever drink or libation or elixir that you want, you ask this cup and it will provide it. And it has been of great use to us. But we want to give it to you, for it might be a good boon, a blessing in your search for Valaman, the white bear king. And she took it and she said, thank you. And as she left, the girl said, you could come back, teach me another song. The princess said, I will. And away she went. She was lost at times. She was lost at times. And so at times she would wait until the sun set and she would look up at the sky. And though she would lose her bearings upon the earth, she realized, looking up at the sky, she could see the great bears, Ursa Major, Ursa Minor. And it was the great bears in the sky that helped her to find her bearings upon the earth in her search for Valaman, the white bear king. And in that way she continued on. Well, you know, she's been to 2 huts. And you probably know, being a fairy tale, the requirement. She has to go to how many? Right, 3. She came to the last one, and it was a house of sod. It looked like it grew right out of the ground. It was in the afternoon, and outside of it there was a young girl playing and an old crone there hoeing in the garden. And the crone said, "'Tis rare when we have a passer-by here. What is the nature of your errand?" And she said, "I seek Valaman, the white bear king, my beloved." "Ah, that's good. You're looking for him. Well, he was here, but gone so soon. To the great glass mountain. You know where it is, east of the sun, west of the moon. But come in now and bide with us." And she did. And didn't the princess notice this little girl had so much energy? She loved to climb trees and run around. And she said, "Sweetheart, have you ever learned to dance? Do you like to dance?" And the girl said, "What's that?" And so the princess did for her what her sisters had done for her. They taught her little dances and steps. And she gave her poems and told her stories. And the next day at the breakfast table, the little girl said, "What is it you most like to eat in the morning?" And the princess said, "Well, it would be ham and eggs and a hot scone with butter and jam." And the little girl went to the cupboard. She put out a tablecloth, and just like that, that meal appeared. And she said, "Whatever food you desire, you ask this cloth and it will provide it." And she said, "We believe it would be a great boon for yourself in your search for Valaman, the white bear king." And she gave it to her. And as she was leaving, the girl said, "Come back and teach me another dance." And she said, "I will." And away she went. Well, now she's gone to 3 huts, and it might surprise you, she came to a 4th, but it wasn't really a hut. It was just a hovel, a ramshackle sort of catawampus hovel there, right at the base of the glass mountain. Now, this wasn't a mountain of window pane glass. This was an enormous, thick, massive monument, this towering, huge thing rising out of the earth and disappearing into the dark clouds. And it was filled with crevasses and sharp peaks. But the day was getting on, and she knocked upon the door of that hovel, and it opened, and there, no, it wasn't an old woman. It was a young woman, and the princess could see there were children behind her, grasping at her apron, and she could see the children were ill-clothed and seemed poorly fed. But the woman invited her in, and she said, "Sup with us. We're having stone soup," for that's all they had were stones and water. And the princess said, "Good woman," she said, "listen. On my journey, I've been given nothing but boons and blessings every step of the way, and it's time that I provide the same." And so she spread out the cloth, and she put out the cup, and soon, asking the children what they wanted, the table filled with pies and with cakes, and with potatoes and with roasts. And the goblets they filled with teas and with juices, and the children ate. And when their hunger was satisfied and their thirst had been slaked, she asked them what clothes they most desired. And then she snipped from the air with those magic scissors trousers and shirts and blouses and hats and scarves. And they were happy and warm. And it was then that the door opened and a man came in. It was the husband of this woman. It was the father of the children. And he said, after he found out all the blessings that had been provided, he said, "You listen to me now. If you're bound up the glass mountain to find Valaman the White King Bear, you'll be needing a few things. You rest tonight, you sleep well, and in the morning I'll give you exactly what you need." And so that's what happened. The princess, she slept. And as she slept, this man who was a blacksmith, he went out to his shop there. And soon you could smell the smoke pouring out of it. You could hear that hammer ringing through the night. You could see the sparks flying. And at first light he came in to the hut with a set of iron claws, sharp iron claws for her hands and her feet. And he said, "You'll be needing these. And listen to me now." And he told her exactly what to do. She bid farewell to that family, and she started to climb this great glass mountain. You know, as she had moved through the forest, she was cold, she was hungry, she was afraid at times, but now it was utter terror that she felt. For the winds, they whipped and they froze her. And the higher and higher she went, she looked down, and that blacksmith hut was just nothing more than a speck. And she knew that one wrong footfall and she would slide to her doom. And yet she did what he said. She dug in with all her strength. And she grasped and she climbed, and slowly, slowly, slowly she ascended the mountain. And as she did slowly ascend, she realized that all that time in those woods and on the journey had given her a strength in bone and blood and in heart that she had never, ever known before. And she realized that she could climb up that mountain. And as she did in time, the terror that she felt, it became a moment where she appreciated that serene, majestic beauty all around her. She looked out at the light, and on, slowly she climbed up and up and up and up, and in that way, finally, she found level ground, and she walked through a fog. And it was then that she began to hear pounding of hammers and saws and men calling out and speaking, and women as well. It was the sound of activity and industry. And as she came through this fog, she saw this amazing meadow, this beautiful meadow, ringed by these towering mountains behind it. And she could see these carpenters building a platform and a staircase up to it, and railings, and women, they were putting garlands of flowers around railings and posts and stringing beautiful banners. And the princess asked one of the maidens, is this a ceremony, a feast, a festival of some kind? And the maiden said, well, it's all of the above. For you see, in 4 days' time, the troll queen hag is going to marry Valaman the White Bear King. For she put him under a spell long, long ago. And for want of perfect love, the spell couldn't be broken. And so now he belongs to her, and they'll be wed in this place. And the princess said, where can I find this Valaman White Bear King? And where can I find this troll queen hag? And a carpenter who overheard the conversation, he said, well, that's really not something I'd recommend. But if you're bound to do it, do you see that bridge there, that huge wooden bridge that spans the deepest chasm of the world? And she said, I do. Do you see on the other side that castle there that seems to suck the light and heat right out of the sky? She said, I do. Valaman, the White Bear King, has a room there. And you see that tower with the arched window? That's where the troll queen hag lives. But I wouldn't suggest gaining her attention, for she wears a necklace of skulls. She has a nose as long as your arm. Bats, they fly out of her ears at night and return at dawn, and she sharpens her teeth with a chisel. But the princess had an idea, and she asked the carpenter for his help. And they walked across the bridge, and right below the window of the tower, she had to make a table with some seats. And she put out her cup. And it just so happened that at that time, way back then and there, just like right here and now, it was about 5 o'clock, which of course is what? Happy hour. Exactly. But those people had not known happy hour because the queen had given them nothing more than stale beer and watered down wine. So as people went this way and that, the princess would call out, what is it you'd most like to drink? And people would say, well, a glass of schnapps or a fine ale. Or some women say a Chardonnay, with a hint of oak, kind of a buttery finish. And on and on and on it went until pretty soon the tables were filled with cups and there were people drinking and talking and laughing, because what she found out was that if you have good drink to serve for free, you'll have people to come and drink it. And pretty soon there was such a commotion, you could see this big nose emerge out of the tower window. It was the troll queen hag. And a raven flew out of her nose and perched upon a big wiry hair. And the troll queen hag said, so, what is it you have there? And the princess looked up and she shuddered and she said, oh, great queen, it is a magic cup. You just ask for whatever libation you want and it's yours. And wouldn't that be a grand thing to have at a wedding? For you could give everyone there whatever libation they'd wanted, and wouldn't they toast you proudly? And she said, good, give it to me. Ah, she said, but queen, it has a price. Nothing much. Just one night by myself with Valaman the White Bear King in his chamber. Well, I guess there's no harm in that. And so that night, the princess appeared at Valaman's bedroom door. But what she didn't know was that the queen had come there first, had put a powerful sleeping draught in his wine and given it to him. So when the princess entered, he was just asleep. And sleeping so deeply, so deeply that she shook him, but he slept. She told him that she was there, that she loved him. She told him everything she'd been through, but he just slept. And if that isn't a metaphor for communication between the genders, I don't know what is. All she could do was weep. She wept and wept and wept all night long, and at first light she was ushered out of the room. But that afternoon, we can probably imagine, she went to the same table beneath the same window. She put out the tablecloth, and as people came by, she was calling out to them, what would you like to eat? And pretty soon she was serving fine dishes like they'd never had before, because the queen only had given him gruel and stale bread and cheese. And now there were fine plates of food, and all gathered, and pretty soon they were talking and laughing, and the aroma of the food went up into the palace window, and soon that big nose came out, and the Troll Queen hag says, "What do you have there?" And she said, "Oh, great queen, it's a magic tablecloth. You just ask for whatever it is you want to eat. And wouldn't that be a grand thing to have for a wedding? Because you're probably going to have some picky people from Portland, Oregon there. They're going to want gluten-free alternatives and kale salad and that kind of stuff." And she said, "Yeah, well, give it to me." And she said, "Well, it has a price." One more night with Valim and the White Bear King alone in his chamber. And you can probably imagine that night was a lot like the first night. The queen arrived first, put a sleeping draught in Valaman's wine, gave it to him, and in no time he was asleep. And though she tried to rouse him, he couldn't be roused. And she did nothing but weep and weep and weep and weep all night long. But that night was different as well, because you see, when she left the next morning, it just so happened right across the hallway, there were a couple of carpenters. You see, they had a room in the palace there too. And they had heard for 2 nights now some woman just weeping and crying. And it wasn't just grieving, it was keening. It was the deepest kind of sadness. And they opened their door as she left on both mornings, and they saw this regal woman, this noble woman, with a tear-stained face. And so they went to Valaman in secret, and they said, "Valaman, who is this woman that comes to your room each night and weeps and weeps and weeps?" And he said, "What? What woman?" And they described her to him, and he said, "No, my beloved, she somehow found a way. She came through the wild wilderness. She came up the glass mountain. She found a way into my room past the Troll Queen hag." And then he realized what had happened. And he asked the carpenters for their assistance. Well, you can probably imagine that next afternoon, that same afternoon, the princess, she went to that tower window and put out the table. And now as people passed by, she said, "What would you like to wear?" You see. For they were dressed in nothing but rags and coarse clothes. And of course the carpenters, they all wanted a pair of Carhartt overalls, and she made kilts and capes for the artists, and it was an old story. So some of the women wanted those Liz Claiborne jackets, with the big puffy shoulder pads, and she made those. She made wonderful clothing, and pretty soon it was like a festival out there. And the queen poked out her nose and said, "Now, what have you got?" And she said, "Well, queen, look at this. It's a magic pair of scissors. And wouldn't that be grand? You could make your own wedding dress, black leather probably, maybe with rusted barbed wire threads and a big red lightning bolt down the front." "Ah, that's good. Give it to me." "All right, you probably want one more night with Valaman, the White Bear King." "Ah, that's right." And so she came the third night. And of course, the queen had already come. And hadn't she put the sleeping draught in the wine, and hadn't she come into the room, and hadn't she given it to Valaman, and hadn't he taken it and put it to his lips? But right at that moment, there was a knock at the door, you see. And the queen, she went over, she opened the door, and there were a couple of carpenters there. And they said, "Well, queen, we just needed to ask you something about the construction project here, the staircase in particular, leading up to the platform there. We wanted to know, did you want the 15-inch treads and the 5-inch risers, or the 11-inch treads and the 7-inch risers? You see, we also think that instead of just the lag bolts, we should put some 5/8-inch through bolts in there just for a sturdier staircase. But we need you to sign off on it." And he said, "Oh, yeah, well, okay, all right, good, go." But that allowed Valaman, you see, just enough time to take the cup and pour it into a flower vase and then put it to his lips. And just as the hag turned, it looked like he'd been drinking the wine, and he gave it to her, and she said, Good night. Tomorrow's a wedding day. Get some sleep." And he feigned sleep. But she was suspicious, because aren't the ones that are the most suspect the most suspicious? And she just happened to have a 12-inch hardwood darning needle in her pocket. And she went back into the room, and she took it, and she just stabbed Valaman right through the arm. But he'd been expecting something, and all he did was sleep right through the pain. And she said, "Well, good, he's asleep," and away she went. And now, when at last the princess came in and saw her beloved, and he saw her, you might say the subject of that night was love. He was so happy to see her. and to hear her tale of all she'd been through, of all she'd done to find her way here and to come after him. He told her everything that he had been through, and that when he put foot upon that place, her realm, the Troll Queen Hag's realm, the spell had been broken. He was a man all of the time now. They spent that night, and at first light, she was ushered out of the room. But Valaman, he went across the hallway to thank the carpenters for assisting him in bringing he and his beloved together again. And then he asked them if they might do him one more favor. And you need to know there was no love lost between Valaman, no love lost between those carpenters and the Troll Queen Hag. For hadn't they labored on her behalf for a long time and never known a penny or a farthing or a cup of kindness or a slab of meat upon their plate? And so they listened to his plan. It was the wedding day. It was the wedding day, and soon after, Valaman, you see, he dressed in his wedding garb. And the princess went off and was helping the maidens prepare for the wedding. Now you could see all of them, you see. You could see all of them now leaving the castle there and walking all and sundry across the great wooden bridge that spanned the deepest chasm in the world, over to the festival grounds where there was the great stage and flowers all around. It was so beautiful. And now all were upon the stage, and all turned, and trumpets blared. And at that moment, of course, the courtyard doors opened, and out came the carriage towards the bridge. And in the carriage, there was the bride, the Troll Queen Hag, dressed in her black leather wedding dress, with all of her bridesmaids, all of her bristled, snouted, red-eyed bridesmaids with her. And all watched as the carriage, you see, it came to the bridge. And then it came onto the bridge. And then it stopped in the middle of the bridge. And no one knew why. No one, you see, except for Valaman and a couple of carpenters. For you see, he told them of a plan. And they smiled wide and they said, Valaman, you know, our skills are commensurate with that plan because as carpenters, we are experts at designing doors, installing doors, crafting doors, whether they're barn doors or courtyard doors or castle doors or cellar doors, or when the need arises, trap doors. And the people watched as the carriage came to a stop. And then screams went up from the carriage. For hadn't the carpenters gone out early that morning? And these were men who knew the loading capacities of various beams and posts, and the sheer strength of planks and nails, and where to place hinges and hafts and throw bolts, and they did. And a trapdoor opened. And you might say that the cruel reign and rule of that queen, it succumbed to a greater law, the law of gravity. And this carriage just fell through the sky, thousands and thousands of feet. And I know what you're thinking, but I want you to relax. You're thinking, Will, why did innocent horses pulling the carriage have to die? And I want you to know, they didn't. You see, Valaman, being an animal himself in part, he made sure that their harnesses and reins were loosened. So as the carriage fell, they just slipped off, which is to say that no horses were harmed in the making of this fairy tale. However, for the passengers inside the carriage, it was quite different. For they fell down and down and down in that carriage, and all of the inhabitants within it, they smashed, and they were smashed to a million pieces, just like dust. And the four winds of the world carried them far and away. But you can be sure they'll be back someday in another form. But not today. Not in this story, not in that place. No, in that place, a shout of joy and celebration went up among the people. And they decided that since a wedding had been prepared, and the tables had been set, and the stage and the flowers put out, that indeed a wedding should take place. And so it was that in that place on that day, Valaman the White Bear King and the princess, they were wed in that place. And the joy was so great. For as the great Welsh poet Shanock Pugh once said, sometimes things don't go after all from bad to worse. Sometimes the grape fends off the frost, green thrives the crops don't fail. Sometimes a man aims high and all goes well. Sometimes we become what we are meant for. A people at times will turn away from war, elect an honest man, decide they care enough not to leave some stranger poor. The sun at times will melt a field of sorrow that seemed to be hard frozen. May it happen for you. Well, it happened for these people on that day. For with that wedding and that celebration, couldn't you feel the warmth again begin to flow among them? The kindness, the generosity, the goodness that had long been frozen, it began to thaw. And the joy in that place was so great, it was carried away by the winds. It dripped down into the streams. It traveled all throughout the world. Some of it even dropped down here upon us in Zoom land tonight. The next day, Valaman, the white bear king, and his bride, they left. But behind them they left the tablecloth of abundance and the magic cup and the shears to those people who had built and made that wonderful realm. And on their way home, you can probably imagine, they stopped. They made 3 stops at 3 huts in the woods. For you see, those crones, of course, were Valaman's sisters. And those young girls, they were the daughters of Valaman and the queen. The daughters who he had placed with his aunts, with his sisters rather, just on the offhand chance that his wife might need them as allies someday in her search for him. But now all gathered and all returned to the castle of Valaman. In time, another wedding was held, and the affair was just incredible. And because it happened in once upon a time, people from the past and the present and even the future came. Johnny Cash sang there, Joni Mitchell as well. Rumi read poetry, and Hafez and Kabir. John Cougar Mellencamp played, and Doc Watson. It was amazing. I know I was there. I told a couple of stories. But you know, all the stories I told there, just like all the ones I tell here, well, they finally did come to an end, you know. But there is no such thing as a story without a good ear to hear it and a heart to hold it. And all of you have done that. And I thank you for helping me bring to life this massive epic tale of Valaman the White Bear King and his fierce and good-hearted and beautiful queen. And that's the story, the epic Norwegian folktale of Valaman. To all of them, to their journeys, to all of our journeys as well. And so, my friends, I know there might not be too much fizz left in the bottle, but I want to just finish with a quick song. It's just yet another face of love. It's very short. This is a story, it's an Irish song. It's a story about a young woman who's seeking a husband and finds a good candidate and goes to her father to tell her the good news. And he has some rather disturbing news in turn. So it's told from the woman's point of view. So you'll have to imagine me as a fetching, fair young lass. I know it's kind of a stretch. It's called Johnny Be Fine, Johnny Be Fair. Johnny be fine and Johnny be fair, and he longed with me to wed. And oh, I would have married Johnny, had not my father said, Daughter, I'll tell you something that your mother never knew. Johnny is a son of mine, and therefore kin to you. Oh, what a shame. But then I met Ian, and Ian was fine, and Ian was fair, and he longed with me to wed. And I would have married Ian, had not my father said, Daughter, there's yet another thing your mother never knew. Ian is also a son of mine, and therefore half-brother to you. But then I met Seamus, and Seamus was fine and he was fair, and he longed with me to wed. And we were busy making wedding plans until the day my father said, Daughter, there's yet another thing your mother never knew. Seamus is also a son of mine, and therefore not an appropriate husband for you. Well, now you never did see a lass so sad and sorry as I was. All the boys in town were me brothers, and me father was the cause. If this should thus continue, I would die a single miss. I think I'll go to me mother and complain to her of this. Well, but my mother said, daughter, haven't I taught you to forgive and to forget? So your father sowed some wild oats. There's no need for you to fret. Your father may be father to those boys in town, but still, he's not the man who sired you. Lass, marry who you will. Ah, yet another face of love. Thanks for listening, everybody. For anybody still awake and alive that wants to hang out for a while, we'll put it back on speaker view. And thanks again for